Thank you for joining us tonight for our webinar as we discuss some programs for agricultural producers in the midst of the situation we find ourselves in agriculture after the COVID-19 pandemic has been going on for a few months here. We will be joined tonight by a host of panelists. We have Dr. Bart Fischer with us, as well as Dr. Amy Hagerman. I know many people are familiar with those two, and we will get to our panelists here in a moment. First, just wanted to kind of give a run of how this evening will go. First, we will hear from Dr. Fischer. We'll have him do a quick presentation for us on what he sees for programs for producers. Then Dr. Hagerman will present. After that, we will have Oklahoma Farm Bureau President Rod Moselle join us and share some thoughts. And then we will have an open question and answer session for a few minutes before we wrap up the evening. If you want to submit a question for our Q&A session, there's a couple ways to do it. If you're joining us via Zoom on your computer or your smartphone or tablet, you can use Zoom's Q&A functionality to submit a question. We'll be compiling those. If you're joining us on a phone call, or if you'd prefer to text a question in, we will have a phone number I'll give you here in just a moment to text questions. We will compile those questions as well to ask during the Q&A session. You can send your questions at any time. The phone number to text for questions is 405-627-9057. Again, the phone number is 405-627-9057. Feel free to text those questions at any time, and we will be compiling those as well as the Zoom Q&A questions, and I'll be asking our panelists those questions here toward the end of our program. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Bart Fischer. As many of us I know around Oklahoma agriculture know Dr. Fischer, but just to make sure that everyone is aware of where he's at and what he's doing right now, because I know it's been changed since maybe some of us have had a chance to visit with him. Dr. Bart Fischer currently serves as the co-director of the Agricultural and Food Policy Center at Texas A&M University, and he also serves as a research assistant professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics. Before joining the university, he served for more than 8 years at the Committee on Agriculture in the U.S. House of Representatives. He was involved in every major agricultural policy development in Washington, D.C. over the past 8 years, and that includes helping craft and pass the 2014 and 2018 Farm Bills. Dr. Fischer holds bachelor's degrees from Oklahoma State University, a master's degree from Cambridge University, and he earned his PhD at Texas A&M University. Dr. Fischer is the 5th generation to be raised on his family's wheat, cotton, and cattle operation in Southwest Oklahoma, and he continues to be actively involved in the farm to today. He and his wife, Carolyn, reside in College Station, Texas, with their 3 children. Dr. Fischer, just want to turn it over to you and give you the chance to present to our members. Thank you for joining us.
All right, Dustin, well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the invitation, and I appreciate all of you listening in tonight as well. For an Oklahoma farm boy, it's great to be back home, even if it is via a webinar. It's great to be with you this evening. I'm going to jump right in. We're getting some feedback, but I'm going to jump right into the presentation and hope everybody can see it. I'm going to really start out really by talking about some of the actions that Congress has taken over the last couple of months in response to COVID. The first action really was on March 4th. Of HR 6074 was passed. This largely dealt with funding federal agencies and the initial federal response kind of quickly out of the gate. Congress followed suit again a couple of weeks later. This was more constituent focused on things like free testing, dealing with unemployment insurance, those sorts of things. But really the one that everyone talks about is the CARES Act, which passed on March 27th, a little over a month ago. That was the bill that injected about $2 trillion into the economy. One of the flagship pieces of that bill was the $1,200 per individual with income less than $75,000. Those were the ones that caught the headlines. But it was also the bill that delivered the aid for production agriculture. And so I'll spend the bulk of the time there. I also have it listed on the slide, as TBD on phase 4. Congress is already in the process of thinking through what that could entail. Our center, the Ag and Food Policy Center at A&M, is already fielding a lot of questions from both the House and the Senate over what might go into that package. But at this point, we're all still very much focused on implementing phase 3. In terms of a general overview of the CARES Act, I often spend a lot of time focused on the Paycheck Protection Program. That's been very popular over the last few weeks. But quite frankly, Oklahoma Farm Bureau has done a really good job of getting the word out on that. I've already done a couple of webinars, and so beyond mentioning it and a couple of other key features, I'm gonna leave it at that. One thing that I will mention there in the note, following both of those bullets, both on the Paycheck Protection Program and on the Economic Injury Disaster loans, both of those being small business loans. Last week, Congress passed H.R. 266, essentially revisiting phase 3, where they plussed up the Paycheck Protection Program with an additional $310 billion. They also then made the EIDL loans, agricultural enterprises, eligible for the EIDL loans. And so again, Oklahoma Farm Bureau has covered those topics well. If you have questions on them, I'm happy to get into it in Q&A. And so for now, I'm going to focus on the things that are highlighted in yellow there at the bottom of the screen, primarily assistance for agriculture, and we'll really take each one of those in turn. Before I get to those, the thing that I did want to mention, additional things I did want to mention on the Paycheck Protection Program is primarily that third bullet there at the bottom. And that is, as of this week, SBA has clarified the treatment in PPP for several different business types. So whether you're operating in partnership, whether you're operating as an LLC, regardless of how you're filing your taxes as the LLC, or if you're a sole proprietor operating on Schedule F, they've clarified how those rules work. The biggest challenge we're still working on is that if you're a Schedule F filer and you had no net farm profit last year because it was a rough year, then there's really nothing there to rely on. And so industry is looking at some other solutions there. And I don't know that the final script has been written on it. But part of the challenge we've been having with PPP is that we're spending time resolving these problems while others are getting the loans and the programs are reaching their capacity. But regardless, we're going to keep working on them. With respect to agriculture assistance to producers, really the only thing in the CARES Act that directly addressed something Farm Bill related was on the marketing loan. This was something we looked at during the Farm Bill but decided against doing. In this context, Congress decided to go ahead and proceed forward with it, and that was extending loan maturity from the typical 9 months up to 12 months. So if you've put a commodity in the loan, you now have an additional 3 months to repay that commodity loan. And that maturity extension there in the second bullet, it does apply to non-recourse loans for the 2018, 2019, and 2020 crop years. Those loans must be in good standing with a maturity date of March 31, 2020 or later. Or on the new crop, the loan must be requested by September 30th. And then any new loan requested by that time will have a maturity date 12 months following the date of approval. I've listed there on the screen the commodities that are eligible. This virtually perfectly overlaps the list of loan eligible commodities straight out of the Farm Bill. One of the other key features then in the CARES Act, the one that's catching a lot of attention, was the direct assistance to agriculture. This is the one, really everyone wants to know the details of, and we'll talk a little bit about that tonight, but one of the key takeaways is that those details are still under development. But in terms of what was actually included in the CARES Act, let's actually start with the second bullet there. The second bullet is that the CARES Act replenished the existing borrowing authority under the CCC by $14 billion. You could think of the CCC essentially as USDA's credit card. They put all of the programs that they run, or most of the programs they run, on that credit card. They've got a $30 billion limit on that credit card, and occasionally then Congress has to come back in and pay off that bill. And that the appropriators typically do that. In the past, it's always been whatever the gap was, we refill it. Unfortunately, over the last 6 months, the replenishment of the Commodity Credit Corporation has become much more political. And this, to my knowledge, is the first time we've ever done a finite replenishment. I might be wrong on that, but in the look that we've taken, we haven't found another example. And so they did replenish it to the tune of $14 billion, but not the entire amount. The Senate had also proposed expanding the borrowing authority so that the Secretary would have additional flexibility to address the needs that are out there. That was pushed by Senator Hoeven out of North Dakota. He chairs the Senate Ag-Approp Subcommittee. Unfortunately, that was ultimately scuttled in the agreement that moved through the Senate, and so we were left with $14 billion replenishment of the CCC. If we move back up to the top of the screen then, the Act also provided an additional $9.5 billion. This was independent of the CCC, provided $9.5 billion to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus by providing support to ag producers. It went on to list some particular sectors, but really the flexibility is entirely up to the department. The secretary can decide which ag producers he wants to spend it on, and so there was really a tremendous amount of flexibility. The last bullet on the slide then is primarily has to do with commodity purchases. Typically tends to deal more with the perishable commodities, fruits and vegetables, dairy, some meat. And if folks want to talk about that under Q&A, I'm happy to revisit that. Otherwise, I'll leave that there. So then that brings us really to, we have this authority in the CARES Act. So how is it being used? What's being done about it? And on April 17th, a week ago on Friday, President Trump announced the creation of the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, or CFAP, which will provide $19 billion in aid. And you may be thinking to yourself, $19 billion in aid, you just told me that they got $14 billion and $9.5 billion, that's $23.5 billion. Why are we only talking about 19? The reason primarily is that of that $14 billion replenishment, it doesn't technically come online until July. The replenishment happens effectively in July. And so the secretary at a point in time looked at how much money do I have right now at my disposal. He had the $9.5 billion, had about $6.5 billion in the CCC available immediately. And that was what they used to craft the $16 billion portion of this CFAP package. And so they did commit to spending $16 billion on direct support to farmers and ranchers, and then $3 billion in commodity purchases and distribution. That $16 billion may sound like a familiar number. It's roughly what we spent on the market facilitation program last year. It's unquestionably a lot of money, but I think the thing to think about this time is that a lot of those issues from last year are still persisting, and we're also now dealing with an additional collapse due to COVID. And there are a lot of additional demands on that $16 billion, probably one of the most prominent being beef, which wasn't really even eligible for MFP last year. And so I think in the grand scheme, that $16 billion is going to prove to be insufficient, and there's going to be conversations about additional funding. And one of those is already starting to take place, because there is a lot of question about, well, that $14 billion that's coming in July, how is that going to be used? And we can talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. So with respect to the $16 billion, the $1 million question then is, well, how's it being used? And when can we expect to see details? And I'm sure some of you are tuning in tonight hoping that I would be spilling the beans and releasing those details here tonight. That's really USDA's job. They're the one creating this program. They'll be the one releasing those results. I happen to think, though, that it's a good thing that we still don't have access to those results, because it means they're still working on it. And the reality is, when that $16 billion was floated out there, there was quite a bit of pushback against USDA, in part because of these two sub-bullets here about how they plan to spend the $16 billion, and then also on the payment limit. So on this $16 billion in aid, they're planning to spend part of it on paying 85% of the loss on products marketed between January 1 and April 15th for any commodity that saw more than a 5% decrease in price. And so if you marketed during that range, then you would see 85% of the loss covered. If not, then you're looking at 30% of expected losses after April 15th and really throughout the next 2 quarters. That immediately set off alarm bells. If you look at just the row crop sector, we're focusing on carryover from 2019, but everybody is worried about getting in the field and figuring out how we're going to cash flow the 2020 crop. And we're doing that as we'll look at a few slides here in a minute about some of the exposure there. So there's certainly a lot of angst. And in this package, they're looking at really only between 3 and 4 billion as expected to go really to row crops, and not much of that at all is focused on 2020. So there was immediately a lot of pushback over that factor. Another one that I got a lot of calls about, both from DC, but also from around the country, certainly applies in Oklahoma too, is that, what's magic about that April 15th number? If I pulled calves off a wheat pasture and sent them to Oklahoma City or Clinton or wherever else, whichever other, yard you're sending at auction house you're sending them to, what's magic about that number? What if I was holding on to them, grazing out my wheat and marketing them after? Why in one case am I getting 85% and 30% in the other case? Those are all questions that are being asked. We're being asked those questions. Again, I take it as a good sign that even USDA is reaching out, asking questions and asking for analysis as well. And so, there were rumors over the weekend. There were some press reports that this package had already gone to OMB for approval. Have it on pretty good authority that that's not the case, that USDA is actually still working on it. And again, I know everyone wants details, but I think it's a good sign that they're taking in some of this feedback, and hopefully some of these things are going to be addressed in that package. One of those things, the next to last bullet there on the slide, has to do with payment limits. Typically on the income support programs in a farm bill, we often have the discussion about payment limits. We then also have the discussion, we've had the discussion in the context of trade and the market facilitation payments, but there was a letter sent from even on the Republican side. 121 House Republicans sent a letter to the Secretary this week raising some of these issues. One of them is probably maybe too small to see on the screen, but one of them is really questioning the payment limits, because regardless of the size of your operation, you're feeling the pinch right now significantly. And if you look at dairy as an example, that payment, $125,000 payment limit, up against the losses that we're seeing, you could hit your payment limit in a matter of hours or days, depending on your size. And even for a small dairy, it doesn't really take long to hit the limit. And typically these are couched as annual limits. And so there's been a huge amount of pushback on the payment limits. Again, the Secretary says, well, my hands are tied because you only sent me a certain amount of money. We had been asking for significantly more. And so this conversation is still playing out. And again, I think it's a good thing that we still haven't seen the details, because hopefully it means that some of these are being addressed. One of those that I mentioned earlier, we had talked a little bit about more, is on the 2020 crop. That $14 billion that's coming up in July, that same letter there at the bottom, really leaned on or requested that the president go ahead and clarify exactly how that $14 billion is going to be spent. I think with the expectation that a lot of that would be geared towards helping out on the 2020 crop, particularly for row crops. And so a lot of this is still in flux. Everyone is wanting details. And my perspective at this point is that there were some things that needed to be addressed. And I think USDA is taking some time to take a second look. And so stay tuned. Happy to talk about that more to the extent that I can. I also wanted to spend a little time then this evening just talking about the impacts. We did a study down here. It's available on our website, looking at the impacts on Texas agriculture, looking at if prices don't improve, we could see losses in the $6 to $8 billion range. That's really just Texas. We wanted to take a broader look across the country. And so our sister center at the Food and Ag Policy Research Institute at the University of Missouri had run a macro analysis looking at impact on prices, on plantings, on net farm income. And we took all of that input and ran it through all of our representative farms to look at, across all of the farms that we maintain, what would be the impact. For those of you who aren't familiar with our process, we do use what are called representative farms. They're panels of 3 to 5 producers scattered all over the country, have almost 100 farms across the country. And then typically, when Congress is looking at policy changes, they'll call us, and then we'll be able to simulate the impact on all of those farms. They're all, essentially on paper, we have financial statements built out, but they're all built out by local producers, and they're intended to represent their particular area. You may notice the giant donut hole there in the middle. We do not have any rep farms in Oklahoma, but with the new co-director who happens to be from Oklahoma, who happens to be an Oklahoma farm kid, hopefully that gap will get closed. Will get closed one of these days. But we use the representative farms to be able to speak to the financial picture and the impact of policy changes or the impact of changes in the market at the farm level. When we do that, then across all of our farms and kind of sum up over the farms, this is the picture of where, using the macro estimates from FAPRI at the University of Missouri, running them through our whole farm simulation model. So bundling it all up together, what is the impact? The maroon line is the impact on net cash farm income for 2020. The gray line would be the impact on net ending cash. So how much cash do you have in the operation at the end of the year, which would drive any needs for borrowing on lines of credit. If you look across the board, I mean, if we kind of take them in turn, particularly looking at the row crops on wheat and rice, I'll ignore rice. We don't happen to have much of that in Oklahoma, but particularly on wheat, you all have been following the market, know what we've seen there. And part of the decrease that you see even in our rep farms is really being contributed by other commodities on those farms. And so wheat, given the fact that it's a staple commodity alongside of rice, has really seen a different market response out of COVID. I would also say, though, that it's too soon really to set that in stone and say that we're in the clear. And so we're going to keep an eye on that going forward, particularly depending on how long COVID persists and the impact that it does have, particularly on the global economy and purchasing power over time. And so we're going to keep an eye out there. Feed grains is kind of in the middle at roughly 15%. And this is due just to COVID, not any other factors, lingering trade problems, any other supply demand related problems. This is isolated just to COVID. Amongst the row crops, cotton is the one that sees the biggest hit at an 18% reduction. A lot of that, and it may not be easy to explain, but it's relatively easy to explain that when you have a slowdown or closure at the retail sector that affects the mills and mills start shutting down, it immediately starts resulting in cancellations, order cancellations, and it backs right up the chain. And so cotton has really been the hardest hit amongst the row crop commodities. And so there's, I think maybe not predictable, but an explainable pattern of what you see there. If you look then at dairy is really the biggest hit across the board. We're looking at a 58% decline in net cash farm income on 2020, just relative to kind of our pre-COVID baseline. And so a huge hit on dairy. Again, somewhat explainable there. We were all seeing the examples of dumping milk. Very much demand driven, and the fact that we can't turn off the spigot, right? We can't walk out to the barn and tell the cow to quit producing. Doesn't really work that way. And so you either have to go somewhere with it, and if there's nowhere to go with it, you dump it. And just given the demand, the huge shifts in demand, where we've gone from in 2010 onward, we crossed over the threshold of spending more on food outside of the home than we did inside. And now where we've significantly shifted that back to consuming at home and purchasing at retail, has just wreaked havoc in the supply chain. And dairy has really felt the pinch. One of the ones that perhaps is most interesting, and interesting may not be the right word, but one that's certainly getting a lot of the attention then is on beef. An incredibly complicated supply chain. A lot going on there, and all I've got to do is look at my own social media feed with friends, on Facebook, Twitter, and elsewhere, to see that it's an extraordinarily hot topic right now. And I get it. I mean, I grew up on a cow-calf operation, still involved. I get it. And people are hurting. Their bottom lines are hurting. Their livelihoods are hurting. And they want answers. And frankly, it's in some of these other sectors, it's easier to give clear answers. And so I get questions all the time about this, and I don't have a slide on it, but I thought I'd pause here, just on this slide with beef at a 47% drop in net cash farm income this year, and talk a little bit more about kind of what I see as the dynamic going on there. And when I get these questions, or when I peruse Facebook, there's two common themes. It's pretty easy to get to the bottom of what folks are raising or what they see as the issues out there. Number one is packers and price spreads, particularly between farm level cattle prices and box beef prices. That's number one, and the second is imports. Those are the two issues I get asked about more than anything. And part of the trouble I see too is that when I look out there at what's being said, there's a tremendous amount of misinformation. And so I did want to spend a little bit more time on that issue here before I wrap up with my remaining slides. On that first issue, particularly as it relates to packers, which also primarily or generally means talk of collusion or market manipulation. So this connection between collusion, market manipulation, and then these price spreads. What's really going on? And one of the things I hear a lot is that this needs to be investigated. We need to be digging into this. And one of the concerns I've always had is that anyone, you can claim collusion all day long, but claiming collusion doesn't make it so. And really the only way you root out collusion or even see if it exists is to do an investigation. And so I see a lot of calls for investigating, but the reality is we are investigating. That investigation is happening. After the Holcomb fire in August of last year, USDA launched an investigation primarily on some of the wonky things that were happening in prices, divergence between cash futures. They launched that investigation. They've also announced that they're expanding it to include some of these effects that they're seeing during COVID. That's necessarily going to involve working with the Department of Justice. Because of the involvement of futures markets, that involves working with the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. And so I hear a lot about collusion, and the problem I have with that is that none of us can know whether there's collusion, because the only way you find collusion is with an investigation. And I think it's very important to keep in mind that investigation is happening. And so if that investigation turns up problems, and this is really against the backdrop of antitrust laws in this country that are really the envy of the world. You layer on top of that other agriculture specific rules and statutes like Packers and Stockyards Act and Related Act, and we do have a tremendous amount of authority that's there. And so if they do overturn things, then the federal government should use its full weight in chasing these things down and addressing them. But the underlying point there is that just because we think there's collusion there doesn't mean there is, and these investigations need to happen, and they are happening. One of the troublesome points is that all of this is also happening at the same time that plants are facing closures or slowdowns, at a minimum slowdown, and in some cases closures, which from an economic standpoint is kind of this perfect storm, because you have this plant where it either by closing down or slowing down is demanding less, and by necessity, if they're demanding less from the farm level, it's going to put downward pressure on price. And by extension, if there's less product coming out of that plant going to retail, it contracts the supply available at retail, drives up competition, and drives up price, and drives these prices even further apart. It's incredibly unfortunate that it's happening the way it is at the time it is, but it's also partly purely just supply and demand fundamentals driven. And so I am not saying that there's not collusion there. There may be. That investigation is happening, but I am also saying that a lot of this can be explained purely by fundamental supply and demand and economics. On the other side of that ledger, not to completely belabor the issue, but I think it's probably one of the most important issues that's floating around out there, is this issue on beef imports. As the chief economist of the Ag Committee, I also spent 4 years as the trade advisor of the committee. Happened to be in both of those roles when the repeal of mandatory cool came before the House, when the House voted 300 to 131 to repeal mandatory country of origin labeling. An enormously complicated issue, multifaceted issue. I'm a professor. We could spend an entire semester, in class talking about this very, just this one issue. Cost, the issue of cost, the issue of composition of what it is we're actually importing and what we're blending, all of those things. The narrow issue I want to focus though on is on the trade issue in particular. I had a friend post on social media this week, there should be no beef sold in the U.S. if it's not raised in the U.S. It was interesting to me because the producer who posted is also a cotton producer. And who I know can't possibly imagine China standing up and say the only cotton processed and worn in China is the cotton raised in China. We dealt with that when China was stockpiling and incentivizing production, and led to huge stocks, and that was just within the last 5 years. And so, it does boggle my mind to some degree to see them posting that, because we do so heavily depend on exports. And you say, well, that's cotton. Beef is completely different. We're under this enormous input pressure from beef, and I get that all of the time. We're covered up with imported beef, and this isn't a matter of opinion. I'm not trying to influence anybody's opinion. I'm injecting things for discussion, and happy to talk about it more in Q&A. The reality on trade in beef is that over the last 10 years, we have exported $15 billion more than we've imported. Let me repeat that. Because I hear all the time that we're just importing this beef. We've exported $15 billion more than we've imported. And I have, our industry and our government officials have spent years working on export promotion. I've said in dozens, if not hundreds of briefings with officials from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative going through all of these things. If you look at just what the Trump administration has done on getting resolution on our beef hormone dispute with the European Union, or after 20 years essentially of being locked out of China, negotiating access for beef back into China, all these things are very big issues, and really the sky is the limit. The problem is if we start erecting barriers to imports in our country, it doesn't take long before other countries start to do the same. And I hear this argument regularly of, well, we'll continue to export but not import, and that's just not the reality of how things work. And so it is really alarming to me when I hear folks, and it's not a judgment at all, because I know folks are well-intentioned and everyone's trying to find solutions, to the price pressures that we're facing. But it's really alarming to me when I hear those things, because we're effectively putting billions of dollars a year in net exports, which benefit the beef industry, potentially putting those at risk when we talk about erecting barriers to imports. The last thing, and then I'll get off of this rabbit trail and wrap up, is on food safety, because that's another issue that's often argued alongside of restricting imports. We can't import this stuff because it's not safe. These products aren't safe. The one floating around this week is on this unsafe substandard product from Namibia. Why that one's the one for the week? It is. It's all over social media. In terms of food safety, anyone exporting a meat product to the United States has to meet equivalent safety standards, not by their standards, by American standards, and to the satisfaction of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, sending inspectors into those plants to do inspections of those plants. And so as part of that, we also have public notice and comment, where people can go in and comment on that process of establishing equivalency with other countries. And beyond that, we also then subject products to inspection then when they're coming into this country. And so we don't put products on shelves in this country that don't meet our food safety standards. And so it's alarming to me when I hear people making arguments of food safety for meat products in this country, because all of those products are subjected to the same safety standards. And if we start down that road, it also starts to undermine confidence in otherwise the products that we have on the shelves, when all of them are really subjected to the same standards. And so I realize I've belabored that issue, and I didn't have a slide on it, but it's the one I'm hearing about more than any, and thought it was worth spending some time on. I will quickly, at the 30-minute mark, so I'll quickly zoom through here and try to wrap up. Back on this issue of row crops. And what we're going to, and what Congress or what USDA might do going forward. One of the messages that we're conveying to policymakers in Washington, who one of the arguments we hear is that, well, you have crop insurance, why do we need anything else? If you look at cotton as just one example, that gray box is the price discovery period. And so this 68 cents is the crop insurance price going into planting. This blue line is 70%. So if you have average yields and 70% coverage, this is what price would have to drop to trigger an indemnity, roughly 47 cents. So price would have to drop 30%, and you still wouldn't even be triggering an indemnity. And so the challenge right now, and why we think that there's going to have to be additional conversation about the 2020 crop year, is that even with crop insurance in place, producers are experiencing tremendous exposure, primarily in their crop insurance deductible. And that despite the price that was established here, all of the loss that we're seeing is still within the deductible and would not trigger crop insurance. I'm going to zoom then to the last set of topics for the remaining couple of minutes here, and then I'll finish up. One not related to COVID, but that I think is incredibly important, is the WIP program. It was included in the omnibus from December. As noted there at the bottom, sign up began on March 23rd and is ongoing right now. This was added primarily directly to address our part of the world. And as you note in the top, this has been around for a few years now, but quality losses of crops, drought, and excessive moisture were added to the list. To be eligible on drought, you have to be in a county that was D3 or greater in either 18 or 19. If you look just at Oklahoma, I think we're at roughly 53 counties that would trigger at least in 1 year, and then you've got a cluster of 5 counties in the Southwest that would trigger in both years. Still concerning to me when I talk to a number of producers not familiar with this at all, at a time where we're really in a cash crunch and needing assistance. This is for the last crop year, but could certainly come in handy. And so I would encourage you to reach out to Amy, reach out to me, reach out to your county office if you have any questions. I'm going to skip the examples in the interest of time, and I will note that there are still a list of issues we're working through on this. One of them was that Mr. Conaway and Mr. Lucas had asked us to look at the unharvested factors for WIP Plus, and we submitted an analysis to both states. And as of this morning, I got word that those had all been approved. And so I think a lot of credit goes to Chairman Lucas and then to the state committee. You know, those 5 members who represent producers on the state committee, it was really their decision to set those factors. And so I commend them for getting that done. And it's looking like the factor in Oklahoma, particularly for cotton, will go from 79 to 90. We're still dealing with some issues on cotton following wheat. The last slide there is really just on sign up deadlines. A reminder that June 30th is your deadline for signing up for 2020 ARC and PLC. You've got till September 30th to update your yield. And then one insurance option that was added in the 14 Farm Bill or in the 18 Farm Bill, primarily for those of you who are grazing an annual forage. So if you're running cattle on wheat pasture, this was created for you. You buy it through your crop insurance agent, and the sales closing date is coming up this summer on July 15th. If you've got any questions about that, but particularly if you have feedback on it, I would love to hear it as we continue to work with Congress on improvements. So I've hit 35 minutes. I'm going to stop there and look forward to coming back later and taking your questions. But thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Fischer. We appreciate your time and your participation. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Amy Hagerman with Oklahoma State University. Dr. Hagerman is an assistant professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Oklahoma State University. She works on issues related to agriculture and food policy. Dr. Hagerman grew up on a family cow-calf and wheat farm in western Oklahoma. She received a bachelor's degree from Oklahoma State University in agricultural economics and completed her graduate studies at Texas A&M University before joining the USDA in 2011. After 7 years with the USDA, first in Washington, D.C., and later in Colorado, Dr. Hagerman returned to cowboy country in 2018. Her extension and research programs focus on helping Oklahoma producers understand policy and manage the risks of agriculture. Dr. Hagerman, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll turn it over to you for your thoughts and your presentation.
All right, thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity to be here tonight, and I appreciate partnering up with Bart. You know, we have actually worked together a lot over the years, and it's always fun to get to be on a same program with somebody that I have so much history with. So I appreciate his comments. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all this evening. What I am going to do is actually spin a little bit off of everything that Bart presented and actually hone in on Oklahoma more so. So, there we go. So what we're really dealing with here is multiple black swans. When we're talking about markets, a black swan is anything that completely comes off of the sideline, a completely exogenous event that can disrupt markets. And in this particular case, in this year, we have really an unprecedented number of black swans that have affected our market. One that actually hasn't received as much attention in the midst of the COVID crisis is the Saudi Arabia and Russia oil dispute, and the fact that that has had significant impacts in oil prices, as you can see from the graph here. And this really impacts us here in Oklahoma. Why? Because we have so many dual income families in agriculture that are affected by oil and gas prices, and they're being affected by COVID-19 at the same time. So that's the reason that we have this pretty unprecedented situation here in Oklahoma. But those aren't the only issues that we've been dealing with in recent years. We've been dealing with retaliatory tariffs on ag products. We've also been dealing on a slightly different side, not necessarily a negative side, but maybe an opportunity side, with the implications of African swine fever in other countries around the world and preparedness for ASF here in the United States. Oklahoma has been very involved and very proactive around both export promotion from the state, creating new markets for Oklahoma products, and also in preparedness for foreign animal disease like ASF. So Oklahoma's been very forward, very, trying to engage and prepare to respond to these kinds of black swan events, but yet we are facing a number of crises that are stacking on top of each other right now. So why is this such an issue? It's not just that we have this disease here in the state of Oklahoma. It's the fact that it's a global issue, and it has literally disrupted our supply chains at every stage. It's not just a cow-calf issue. It affects the sale barn. It affects the stockers. It affects the feedlots. It affects the haulers who are moving those cattle around the country. It affects the packers. It affects the wholesalers, the processors, the retailers. It affects people in other countries and people domestically in Oklahoma and in states surrounding us. That is what is really unprecedented about this particular challenge. Here in the state of Oklahoma, they talk about flattening the curve. This is our curve for COVID here in the state of Oklahoma from the Department of Health. We can kind of start to see that we appear to have turned the corner, if you will. We appear to have hit the peak, and we're starting to see some information about reopening, safely reopening businesses in the state. And at this point, I think it really creates an opportunity to turn the conversation to recovery. And that's what I'd like to do tonight, is spend a little bit of time in spinning this conversation around assistance programs into a conversation around recovery. So impacts on Oklahoma, we all saw the hashtag ag doesn't stop coming from Secretary Arthur. Here in Oklahoma, ag is very important in our state. We value our ag producers. And so ag didn't stop during coronavirus, but we really appreciate the efforts to continue to produce safely. We really have a huge importance in cattle and other livestock here in the state. Bart talked about the impacts of that. Really, timing is everything when we're talking about these coronavirus-related impacts on agriculture. Particularly for our stockers, our stocker producers here in the state, this timing was not good for our stocker producers in the state. And then also for our calf sales. If you go back to some of the estimates in the NCBA report, the per head estimates of losses for 2020, and then you kind of look at that in terms of the extent of beef cattle production here in the state of Oklahoma, just our cow-calf producers could have upwards of $235 million worth of losses in 2020 associated with COVID. Similarly, if we look at our cattle on feed numbers in the state, that could be approximately $70 million in damages in the state. We can talk about our hog producers. We do have a robust hog industry in our state. And if you look at the National Pork Council's estimates of losses for 2020 for damages related to COVID, that could be upwards of $85 million. in damages. So these programs that Bart was talking about to help offset some of the damages in the state are going to be very important for our producers and may represent a pretty high amount of the farm revenues that are coming in this next year. Going to some of our crops, again, timing is everything. When the crop is harvested, when the crop is marketed, and how that factors into this recovery curve that we're going to experience with respect to COVID. This is where we start having the recovery conversation. And as Bart had talked about, when we're talking about not just the crop that is continuing to be marketed out of the 2019 crop year, but then also what we're harvesting and marketing out of the 2020 crop year. So recovery timing becomes as important as harvest timing and market timing. You know, wheat crops are largely sold from the 2019 crop year. By the end of February, about 80 to 90% of our wheat crop has already been sold. Fall harvested crops obviously are going to face bigger challenges from the 2019 crop year. And then we go into the impacts of the 2020 crop year, which that marketing year starts June 1 and will go on into 2021 for wheat. So this is where I think some of these programs that Bart was talking about come into effect. We can talk about crop insurance. Certainly that is an important risk management tool for our producers here in Oklahoma, for our crop producers. Our cattle producers, there is one revenue insurance tool that is available to our cattle producers. We certainly hope that some people took advantage of that and provided some risk protection for themselves, but there are relatively fewer risk management alternatives for cattle producers versus our crop producers in the state. We also hope that we had good sign up under our ARC and PLC programs. But the timing of those are challenging. The timing being, that 2019 crop year payments will be coming out this fall, then 2020 crop year payments will be coming out in the 2021 year. So the timing of those payments are challenging, and that's why it's important to take advantage of these programs as they come available. The WIP Plus program is a great example of that, taking advantage of programs as we can. Just in terms of other kinds of impacts around Oklahoma agriculture, it isn't just the commodities that are taking a hit. Many of our farm families are dual income, and they may be taking hits on multiple fronts on their farms. This is going to create operating income and cash flow challenges for many of our households. We do have, of course, the tax advantages that have come out for this year, the tax rebates, the individual tax rebate. You guys have heard probably J.C. Hobbs talk about those, trying to keep us up to date on the latest information, the opportunity to delay first and second quarter tax payments into the July 15th deadline. Also, I think we need to remember our farms that are doing direct sales. There have been shifts away from this restaurant business into direct family sales. Pivot. That's really the point that we're at in agriculture right now. We are trying to pivot. Farmers markets for 2020, will consumers feel safe? Will we see the kind of direct marketing that can take place in farmers markets compared to what we normally do? Or will we see more of these direct farm to family sales? We're already seeing industries or organizations advertising direct farm to family sales here in the state of Oklahoma. That, of course, requires technology. And this is a whole new challenge for us here in Oklahoma. We've always known that we have a challenge associated with broadband in our rural communities. And one of the really encouraging things around not only the 2018 Farm Bill, but also the CARES Act is the expanded funds to help expand broadband in the state. We do have technology challenges in taking advantage of technology because of our broadband availability. Rural development here in the state recently announced that Oklahoma had the highest number of grant applications for expanded broadband grants as compared to other states. So clearly there's a recognition of the need. That isn't grants that have been awarded yet. We're just talking about applications at this point, but clearly We are recognizing the needs in the state, and we are pivoting to take advantage of those. So let's talk about recovery a little bit. Farm Foundation did a survey to ask how many months do you anticipate it will be before the worst effects of the COVID crisis will abate. 35% of responders felt this would take more than 12 months in order to really begin to recover from the COVID crisis. But then, also you had some estimates that were in little lower periods of time as well. The timing of recovery will be crucial. A lot of that timing will have to do with just the virus itself. How soon is it safe to start reopening things? How soon can we begin reopening restaurants? And what are the implications of the safety measures that have to be in place as those restaurants reopen? If tables have to be 6 to 8 feet apart, what does that mean in terms of the capacity of that restaurant and how many people they can serve at any given time? So we will continue to see impacts as we slowly reopen the state in a safe way. But again, we're still pivoting. We're still trying to figure out what the world is going to look like post-COVID. So one thing I want to actually bring up, I spend a lot of time in my research talking about the concept of resilience. What is resilience? Basically, there's three lines of thought associated with that. One is the ability to bounce back to shocks. I think we would all like to say, well, we're going to bounce back to where we were pre-COVID. But I'm not quite sure that's the right definition of resilience for the situation we're in. Another one is the ability to absorb shocks. I don't think anyone has the expectation that we have the capacity to absorb a shock of this magnitude. The third way to define resilience, and I think this is the direction we're going to need to go as a state, is positive adaptability in response to shocks. The ability to not bounce back, not to absorb, but to bounce forward, to adapt structure, adapt functions, and adapt organizations in order to just work in this new world. So I would really encourage everyone to bounce forward from this outbreak. Try to find a way to pivot your business in order to take advantage of the changes that we're seeing. That may be greater grocery store demand versus restaurant demand. It may be more farm to family sales in the state. But let's bounce forward as a state and improve our resilience to this situation. Doggedly looking for opportunities. In the short term, cash flow is going to be an issue for our agricultural operations in the state. Taking advantage of programs like the CFAP program, like ARC and PLC, the additional flexibility in this 2018 Farm Bill to actually change an election starting this fall for the 2021 crop year. As we get more information of what our market is going to look like for various commodities going into the 2021 crop year, there will be the opportunity to change those elections if that seems appropriate. Taking advantage of the WIP plus in those counties that Bart highlighted, using those individual tax rebates in a smart way to protect our families. SBA programs, PPP and EIDL grants. How can we take advantage of those as agricultural organizations? And how can we advocate for the right kind of resources in the right timing to protect our businesses? NRCS and FSA programs, don't forget those regular programs that we have available through the 2018 Farm Bill are still there. Signups are ongoing. This is a great moment to look at your operation, to look at your family, and to figure out if now is the time to pivot. Talk to your county educator about programs and updates. There's so much information out there right now. It can be absolutely overwhelming. So I would really encourage you to be in touch, communicate. Just because we're social distancing, just because we're all somewhat isolated from each other physically doesn't mean we have to be isolated in terms of sharing information. And I really appreciate programs exactly like this one that provide the opportunity to get better information in order to make those decisions. And then the final point I want to make before we wrap up here and move into the Q&A is take care of yourself. This is an incredibly stressful time on all fronts. There are many partners who are providing resources to address the mental burden of this pandemic. So this is just our ODAF website that shows some of the different resources that are available. So I would encourage you, this isn't a time you have to be tough. Talk to somebody, take advantage of those resources, and take care of yourself so that you can be resilient, so that you can bounce forward, so that you can pivot going into the recovery phase of this outbreak. So those are just a few comments that I wanted to make leading into the Q&A session. And I look forward to addressing any questions, Dustin, that folks may have.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hagerman. We appreciate you joining us, and we appreciate your insight. We're going to hear from a moment from Oklahoma Farm Bureau President Rod Moselle, who's joining us. But first, just want to remind folks that if you have a question, feel free to drop it in the Q&A box if you're using the Zoom platform on your computer or a smart device. Or if you'd prefer to text those questions in, the phone number to text them to is 405-627-9057. Again, please text questions to 405-627-9057, or you drop them in the Q&A box on Zoom, and we'll get to those here in just a moment. As soon as we hear from Oklahoma Farm Bureau President Rod Moselle, we're going to turn it over to Rod for his comments.
Good evening. I'm actually not going to make very extensive comments other than to thank Bart and Amy. We deeply appreciate their information tonight and their sharing time with us and the insight that they have. They've been on the front lines of studying these issues, studying all kinds of ag economic issues even before we had COVID to deal with. And now, as all the disruptions that all of our agricultural markets have faced, they've been on trying to figure out how these additional disruptions play with each of the individual commodities and how we can best respond. So we deeply appreciate y'all's insight. I've already gotten several questions come in. I guess one thing I would say, just both of you mentioned PPP, and I get a daily update from SBA, and of course PPP 2, the Paycheck Protection Act 2, which includes farms and ranches, and Farm Bureau has been trying hard to get the word out on that, just opened on Monday morning, and they had a bunch of computer problems even on Monday. But even with all that across the nation, as of last night, there had been 960,000 loans in the second phase of the program, and $90 billion have been committed out of the additional 310 billion as of last night. And today probably took another big chunk out of that 310 billion that's available. But that's pretty astonishing. 960,000 loans just since Monday morning in this second phase. And so those of you in agriculture, if you haven't visited with your banker yet, that money is going to run out probably within just days. And so if you are interested in applying for that, you need to get serious and get that done right away. There were 1,200 banks nationally participating in the first round of Paycheck Protection Act. And as of last night, there were 5,300 lenders that were now set up as SBA lenders and participating. So the subjects we're talking about are all, it seems like every day now, the Wall Street Journal has ag coverage. And the ag stories are becoming mainstream in all of the economic press besides our usual ag trades. Quite a trade today that started on food plant workers and owners clash on safety, but it goes on down into some charts on the pricing for different commodities and transportation issues and so forth. So Bart, you and Amy both find yourself as mainstream news now. I know just in the last couple of days we've had both the Tulsa World and the Daily Oklahoman calling us for additional input and discussion, and we've passed your name around to some of those folks as well. But some of the questions we've already had come in from your earlier discussions, and I'll start with Bart. One of them was on your chart from your representative farms. It's hard to understand the connect between the net cash income numbers you're showing and the ending cash. Some of those would have like huge drops in net cash income. It didn't seem like near as big a drop on the ending cash and vice versa on some of those commodities. Why is there not more of a connect between those two than we might think?
I mean, they're assuming we're unmuted here. I think part of, I mean, there's no simple answer because it's going to depend on every single case. The important thing on net cash income is prior to a lot of those expenses that you occur, so taxes and so on and so forth, and family transfers, so transfers outside the operation to family. And so the assumptions that are made also depend on the location and those individual farm panels as well. I also think you see these are also not just level numbers, they're also percentage numbers. And so a lot of that also depends, like particularly on ending cash. If you looked at the feed grains, there was a huge drop on ending cash in the feed grains. I think a lot of that, it's not necessarily because of the connection to the net cash farm income on this year. It's a connection to the fact that we've drained cash and equity over time as we've kind of survived on this 7-year slide in the farm economy. And so you see a bigger percentage drop in part because of just the position we were in and ending cash expected going into this even prior to COVID hitting. And so that's part of it, and part of it is just the fact that it's in percentage terms, and so your starting point matters a great deal.
I'll ask both of you to address this one. That the secretary put $16 billion on the program right now, but there's this additional $14 billion at CCC that's available July 1st. It appears none of the payments are going to get out till probably June. I'll see what you both think about that. But with that being the case, why do you think they didn't make it a $30 billion program to begin with instead of a $16 billion and still this $14 billion that's out there for a round 2 or for a different program?
Sure, Amy, do you want to jump in first or do you want me to dive in?
Yeah, I can jump in first. A lot of my perspective on that is going to come from my time within USDA. USDA is not a ship that turns quickly. It takes time to put the rules in place. It takes time to put the programs in place. The sooner you can begin to put that infrastructure in place in order to open up a program, in order to have the rules published, the regs published, in order to implement a program, the better off you'll be. So having that initial pot of money, like Bart was talking about, the cash kind of on hand available right away, I think it is important to start putting those programs in place as quickly as possible, because our producers do need that cash quickly. As additional funds come into place in the CCC later in the year, that could set up for additional programs going into the future. Also, it gives us an opportunity to gain more information about this recovery timeline associated with coronavirus and what those impacts might look like. That can refine the estimate of what those payments need to be going forward as well from an analytical perspective. So I'm okay with a 2-stage rollout, if you will, of this aid for producers, because I am a big proponent of getting that first payment in hand as quickly as possible and getting the infrastructure in place to support future payments as needed. So Bart, I'll let you build on to that.
Sure. No, I think that was a good description, Amy. I think so. Partly what's happening is that I have every expectation that the secretary is going to try to get this initial $16 billion out the door in May. It might spill into June, but I think they're going to try to get payments out the door in May. What I suspect may happen, and it's a somewhat informed. It's not necessarily opinion. It's a somewhat informed assessment. Is that everything USDA does has to go through the Office of Management and Budget at the White House. And so it would not surprise me at all if the Office of Management and Budget said that $16 billion, if you read the statute, the $16 billion or the $14 billion replenishment is relative to the June 2020 audit report of the CCC. I can imagine the conversation now, OMB saying, nice try, USDA, but you don't get this money until July. And then USDA, arguing with OMB is about as effective as arguing with a fence post. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that was what was going on, which is also why you see the letters flowing up from Capitol Hill. The one I had a copy of in my slides, the one from the House GOP members, you had 121 Republican members sending a letter to a Republican president about that $14 billion. And even if it's not going to be spent, going to your point, Rod, there is an appetite for knowing where it's going to go, just because there is so much uncertainty out there. So I think it was largely OMB driven, but with pressure now from Capitol Hill, the president may actually just intervene and say, okay, USDA, go commit this $14 billion.
But we've got several people sending in questions wondering about when you think these rules will become clear. We got the, the general announcement of the 16 billion a week ago Friday. Do we think this is likely to happen this week, next week, the week after next week? Do we have any idea at all when we'll have more meat on the bones of exactly how this is going to play out for a beef farmer or a cotton operation or a wheat grower?
So USDA will not put out any details until the Office of Management and Budget is signed off. And every indication I'm getting is that the rule, and again, but from my presentation, I think it's, we're making the most of that opportunity for USDA to incorporate feedback right now, because once it then does go to OMB, no one wants to start that process over again. And so we anticipate the rule could go to OMB as soon as the end of this week. OMB then can take as much time as they want. They're clearly going to be under a lot of pressure to review and turn it around quickly, but that process can take as long as a few days or a few weeks or longer if they wanted it to. And so I anticipate we're still at least a few weeks out from knowing any details. They'll then have to train up staff, and this goes to the question of the level of complication too. This thing is shaping up, at least in how they were initially talking about it, to be fairly complicated. So there could be a training component involved here too before they start taking applications. And so they are under an enormous amount of pressure though to get it done, but I still think we're weeks, not days away from details.
One of the questions that, if I can, I see we had quite a few questions come in about people being able or wondering if they can participate in these upcoming programs from the USDA if they've participated in the SBA Paycheck Protection Program or the EIDL program. Is there any clarity or directions that you're seeing on whether or not farmers who did the PPP program can also qualify for USDA programs?
With the caveat that I am not the final arbiter on this, and so I'm relaying what I have heard, but this is not me guaranteeing anything. I've asked this question a lot in DC, and the answer I've gotten back repeatedly is that they're unrelated and that they're not going to offset. One's not going to count against the other, and so I've heard it from folks very high up the food chain in DC. That they're not, that one's not going to count against the other. But until I see that in writing in an announcement from the administration, it's just me relaying to you what I'm hearing from pretty well-placed people.
Bart, I would add on that, in our president's calls, we've had Secretary Perdue on, and this last week Bill Northey on, and that question was asked specifically to each of them, and both of them said there would be no connection between the two, that they would stand on their own. So again, it's not in writing, but two of the very highest folks in that have said that their plan was to have the ag programs totally disconnected from the SBA programs.
Yes, sir.
Another question that we've had submitted a couple times is how these potential USDA programs might run afoul or comply or not comply with WTO programs, or if that's not a consideration at this point, just taking into account the situation that we're seeing in the world. So how might this interplay with WTO issues?
Sure. Anybody else want to jump in, or I'm happy to jump in there. So
you can start. We'll jump in if we need to.
I think it's a fair question. It's a conversation that we have constantly. When I was on the Hill, as the trade advisor, this was that issue was in my portfolio and worked on regularly. A lot of it is going to. The answer is it's going to depend. Because we report these programs, we have a limitation on what we can spend. $19.1 billion is our amber box limit. And so any program that falls into that accumulates up, and that's what we're judged against 9.1. But a lot of things can fall out of that box. And so, for example, if a program is not tied to the production of a specific crop and it's not crop specific, then there's limitations. As long as it's not more, if it's not crop specific, as long as the amount of non-crop specific support doesn't exceed 5% of the value of production in the country, then it doesn't count at all. If you have crop specific support, as long as it doesn't exceed 5% of the value of that crop, it doesn't count. And so it's an extraordinarily complicated accounting that goes into determining all of that. The key here though is if the department the way the department easily waves their hands at this is that if it's not tied to production, if it's decoupled from what a producer does, where it's based on history or something like that, and it's not literally, I'm producing this amount to get this payment, then it can be submitted as amber box where there's no impact on the 19.1 limitation at all. And so I'm only hedging because I'm not yet privy to all the details either. And so I don't know the extent to which these programs are going to be product specific or non-product specific or completely decoupled altogether. But it's a great question. And it is something that we in the USDA are definitely taking into consideration.
Another question, and this is a little bit different USDA program, I know, but someone was asking about USDA not waiving guaranteed loan fee, FSA loan guaranteed loan fees, saying the 1.5% could help them greatly. Is there any indication that might be on the table at some point, or is that just a discussion that has not occurred, or is that something that either of you have any insight on?
I'll jump in there on this one too, unless someone else wants to weigh in. Just a little bit of background on the loan guarantee, particularly on that fee. In statute, Congress allows USDA to collect fees on the lending programs. The way USDA has handled it is that up until about 8-9 years ago, USDA charged about 1%. They charge it to the lender. The lender obviously can pass it on then to the customer. They revised that up to about 1.5%. Again, roughly 8 to 9 years ago. I don't remember exactly when. The challenge is that USDA is given a certain amount of budget authority in which that they can make these loans. They use then these fees to help expand that budget authority so it can expand the volume of loans that they make. Already via statute, there are several waivers of the fee in place, depending on loan type and depending on whether you're a limited resource, socially disadvantaged, or beginning farmer and rancher. In some cases, the fee's already waived. And so it's a great question. I have no idea on whether USDA is anticipating it, but I am happy to start asking that question. The biggest question is going to be, if we do start waiving that fee without Congress providing additional borrowing authority, does it cut in then into the amount of loans, loan guarantees that USDA could make? And my guess is that absent an additional appropriation from Congress, it probably would cut in because they are using that loan revenue to expand the amount of loans that they can make. But again, I'm happy to run it up the flagpole.
The only thing I would add to that is that limit in the amount of funds is definitely a factor here in the state of Oklahoma. Typically, FSA runs out of those loan funds, aside from some of those specialized groups that Bart was mentioning. Usually early in the year, by February of this year, we were completely out of funds for those programs, for those loans. So I do think that is a valid concern here in the state of Oklahoma.
Another question that both doctors brought up regarding risk management was about the WIP Plus program. We have someone send us a message saying that they had inquired about participating in the WIP Plus program, but they were told they had to carry crop insurance to qualify for participation, and being a beef producer, they did not carry crop insurance. So can you help sort that out for us?
Sure. I can jump in again too. Sorry, Amy. If you want to take it away, that's fine.
Actually, I think your resource that you guys have down at the Policy Center is a great example resource of how these different payments work out. So you take it away.
So they actually, and the one Amy's mentioning, we have a report up on our website that we did particularly on the drought-related provisions of WIP, and then our center was involved, when Congress was actually passing this back in September as well, but. There are provisions in the WIP program. Part of it depends on crop insurance availability. They also then have factors that are tied to uninsured crops and NAP, and so it's not as a rule. There are considerations for cases where things are not insured, and I'm happy to follow up on the very nitty gritty of that because I'd even need to go dig into it myself. One thing though in that question that struck me as well was on the mention of beef. WIP Plus is strictly a crop-based program. It is not an indemnity program for beef. Thankfully, to Mr. Lucas's leadership, we got the livestock forage program permanently funded in the 2014 Farm Bill. It had completely disappeared. He restored that program. He permanently funded it and he beefed it up. We also permanently funded the LIP program. And so you have a couple of separate livestock indemnity programs that are focused directly on livestock. So under WIP is really just directed at crop programs. There are a couple of exceptions to that, but beef and livestock really aren't covered. So even if you had some other insurance, beef is not going to be eligible for WIP Plus.
I know we have a lot of interest in Oklahoma about upcoming USDA programs and how they relate to beef, but we did get a question about the specialty crop segment of that, what that might look like, and if we know any details about participation or anything else about that segment of the upcoming USDA program.
Yeah,
I guess I can start on this one. We do have a lot of specialty crops here in the state. Particularly, we have a pretty robust pecan industry and some of the other specialty crops that are certainly impacted in this first few months of the year. We don't have a lot of details on the specialty crops as well. I will say that Oklahoma State is partnering up with Farm Service Agency, that as soon as we do get some of the details on these programs, we're going to roll out some education for not just our cattle and row crop producers, but also for our specialty crop producers and some of our pecan producers in the state as well. So that would kind of be where I would start on that.
I think Amy's absolutely right. The only thing I would add to kind of at the federal picture is that USDA has struggled with this. On row crops, not as a rule, but for most row crops, they're publicly traded commodities, and we have very robust price reporting, and it's very easy to discover a price for a particular commodity. On specialty crops, it's very localized. And USDA may or may not have any data at all on that specialty crop. And so I happen to think that if they are going to require a producer to show losses, that there's going to be some paper transactions where producers are bringing in information into that FSA office. With all of that said, though, if you look at what, back at the last couple of years, or just look at last year on specialty crops under the MFP program, the trade related program, and what's already been announced, specialty crop producers are looking at roughly 7 to 8 times the amount of support that was provided under the trade aid package. And so it's going to be it's going to be significantly more money, and it's going to be for producers who may not necessarily be that familiar with FSA. And so I think the work that Amy is talking about doing in the state is important, because it is going to require a lot of outreach. And I think Farm Bureau will be helpful in that too. I think the same applies to beef as well. You may have producers who are now eligible for indemnities when they've never participated in anything before. LFP may have helped crack the door on that, but I'm sure you'll still have a number of producers who aren't, who haven't darkened the door of an FSA office.
Let me ask you both, the $16 billion, a lot of people have done the back of envelope math and think if it's going to cover 85% of the losses, that they think that they're questioning whether that number is anywhere near enough to do that, especially since a lot of these are going to be specialty folks or beef folks that haven't been in the database of FSA previously. So I guess the question, do you all think there is enough money there to do the 85% of losses, if that holds as a standard, or do you think that's going to be a number that has to go back to Congress or somebody to bring additional financing for?
So those numbers are really originating in the office of the chief economist at USDA. I have enormous respect for Rob Johansson, Dr. Johansson, and his team there. We work with them regularly. They're a great crew, and they've got access to a lot of data. And so when they're doing this number crunching, it's often against really good data. I think the wild card in all of it, the way that I get to a yes as an answer to your question, Rod, is the payment limit. And I think that's part of the problem we're seeing right now. You think 85% of the loss, I mean, these are astronomical sums. How in the world can we afford all of this? You put these draconian payment limits in place. And so your cattle operation may be experiencing, you may have had $500,000 in losses, and suddenly you're limited to $125,000 payment limit. And so I think the payment limit is the great equalizing factor in all of this, but it's also the one that's getting, and in some cases, even bipartisan blowback. There's been an enormous amount of pushback on the payment limit in this case. And so If they start to lift that, they're going to have to come up with money elsewhere. And if they start to come up with money out of the 14 billion, then it really starts to raise questions of, well, then where in the world are they going to get the money, for row crops? And so regardless of how that ends up getting answered, I think Congress is still going to have to weigh in with additional funding, because when all is said and done, there's still not, I just can't imagine that there's going to be enough there with what's already been allocated.
I would add to that in addition to the payment limit, there's also that April 15th deadline. As Bart had pointed out, what is that April 15th deadline, the implications of that, where it's only 30% of losses beyond that deadline. If we think about the timing of some of the plant closures, what that has meant for farm gate prices for some commodities, a lot of that impact has happened after just in the last few weeks. So I think that depending on where that deadline lands as well, and how much of losses after that deadline, wherever it lands, that is also going to affect just how far those funds can stretch. But in terms of will it actually cover damages? Only time will tell. But in general, I would think that it's going to help offset the losses, but probably not totally offset the damages that are experienced.
One other question along the April 15th date, and Bart, you and I have had this visit. You might give the example of someone who actually was grazing on wheat, which we do often here in Oklahoma, and sold the cattle before the April 15th date, and somebody who's still grazing to April 15th, and give an example of the difference in how the program as currently proposed would affect those two different operators.
Sure. No, and I think you really spelled it out there, Rod. And to be clear, these conversations are happening. These examples, I'll give you this example here, but these conversations are also happening in Washington. And the challenge is, I'm not sitting there making that decision. Even when I was in Washington, I wasn't making that decision because I was on Capitol Hill. Right now, these decisions are being made by USDA, and they've got an enormous amount on their plate. And so, to their credit, they are taking input, but ultimately it's going to be their decision. But yes, in this particular example, there's really, I think what's happening is you have this desire on the part of USDA to say, look, some people are really hurting right now. And if you had to sell into this mess, you're feeling it acutely. And there's a desire on their part, and I get it, I understand that, to really address that need right now. And then there's also this recognition, though, that this thing is persisting and people are going to be in a tight spot going forward. And so I think what's happening and why you see this magic April 15th date is that they're trying to weave both of these realities together. And I don't really begrudge them for that. Like there's a logic to that makes sense. But I also think that what they're working on right now is the finesse that goes along with it. Is April 15th as a hard and fast rule? Does that really make sense? Does it really make sense to say that if I pulled off my wheat pasture and sent my cattle, to the stockyards on April 13th, that any loss from January 1 and January 1, we were still dealing with some pretty decent, cattle prices. It was really the fact that, we're about, in Q1, we're about 6% ahead of where we were last year on supply. So prices were already coming down in February. But if we're looking at January 1 compared to April 15th and the price drop, and says the guy who marketed on April 13th gets 85% of that price drop, and then the guy who marketed 5 days later only gets 30% of any losses projected going forward, it's very hard to explain. And I also get that the department has to draw lines somewhere. But I think the hope right now is that there would be some finesse in there that recognizes if you have a market-aged animal, why does it matter when you're actually marketing it? The fact is, even LFP acknowledges this, right? We count the number of cows, we count the number of calves above 500 pounds as of date certain. And so there are ways for this to be done. And the hope is that USDA, as they work through all of this, will be able to provide some finesse. But again, it's wait and see.
Well, thank you very much. And we're coming close to the end of our time. And so I just want to give all of our panelists a chance to say any last closing comments, if anybody has some things that they wanted to wrap up this evening's program with.
I'll let Amy start, and then I'll finish if you.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. So the only thing that I would say is we are watching this situation very closely. I plan to work closely with our groups here in the state to get education out just as soon as we know anything, to work with FSA to get education out. So as soon as we know something and we know how this will be handled within our FSA offices while they take the appropriate safety measures associated with COVID and as they deal with the challenges of reopening their offices going forward into the future. It's just going to take a lot of patience. We're dealing with a lot of unusual logistics in making this program happen. So just have some patience, but definitely keep your ears open because we will have more information coming out just as soon as it's available.
And I think the only thing I would wrap up is more a point of personal privilege and saying that, you know, particularly over the last 10 years, if I put my old hat on from my time that I spent in Washington, D.C., whether it was, you know, working with Mr. Lucas trying to get the 14 Farm Bill done, whether it was working on getting seed cotton added back to the Farm Bill during the Bipartisan Budget Act, or whether it was working on the 2018 Farm Bill, you know, throughout all of that, I looked at the Oklahoma Farm Bureau as a resource for me. And so, you know, from Rod, you know, to the staff, to the board, and a lot of the members, I've called on Oklahoma Farm Bureau a lot over the last decade, and you guys have never failed. And so I greatly appreciate all of the help over the years. And for folks who are listening, all this stuff can get mundane and in the weeds, but it's incredibly important stuff. And you've got some of the best people in the world representing you. And if you get a chance to participate or engage, and if you're not a member, to become a member, I encourage you to do so and to engage in the process. So thanks again for having me.
Rod, do you have any closing comments? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I just want to say thank you very, very much to Dr. Hagerman. Amy, you were wonderful tonight. We appreciate all you do day in and day out here in Oklahoma. And as the programs become clear, we're anxious to continue to cooperate with you to help get the details out to folks. Bart, you've been an amazing friend and a great policy wonk on ag things for a long time. And it's been our pleasure to have lots of discussions and debates with you on these things. And you've helped educate me immensely. And I'm glad you got to share that with our members tonight. We look forward to repeating this again soon, and are glad to have you back closer to this part of the country where you can spend more time at the family farm and in Southwest Oklahoma. Bart put a plug in for membership. I would just, we invite everybody in agriculture to watch this. If you didn't get to watch tonight, then you missed something, and we hope those that did watch will encourage others. Dustin and his team will post this on our website, so you can look there. On the PPP we mentioned earlier, those earlier seminars on PPP are out on the website that you can go and watch those and get more details. We are planning additional webinars soon. Congressman Lucas, that Bart mentioned several times and he had the pleasure of serving with, is going to be doing one with us about these different farm programs. And then I'm sure we'll be doing one with Amy and Bart again as the details come out. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We look forward to your feedback. If you'll let us know if this information is helpful or what additional programming you'd like to be able to watch on your cell phone or computer as we all deal with these market disruptions. Thank you for joining us tonight. We look forward to turning the corner and reopening Oklahoma and getting ag markets back to some more even keel.
Well, thank you very much again for joining us. As President Moselle said, for those of you joining us on Zoom, once this webinar closes, you'll be prompted to take a survey on our Oklahoma Farm Bureau website. We hope you will do that. Your feedback is invaluable for us as we plan other programs into the future. Again, one more thanks to our panelists, Dr. Bart Fischer and Dr. Amy Hagerman, for joining us, and we appreciate everyone who tuned in. Thank you very much.